Hi everyone, my name is Savannah Duncan, and today I will be presenting my video and learning module topic, agroforestry, and more specifically focusing on alley cropping as it relates to vegetable production. So to start off, I'd like to explain, what is agroforestry? So agroforestry, as defined by the USDA, is the intentional integration of trees and shrubs into crop and animal production systems to create environmental, economic, and social benefits for farmers, forest managers, ranchers, and communities. Now, that's kind of a mouthful of a definition, but it's clear and well defined, and it's needed to understand the many parts of managing an agroforestry production system. So, for a production system to be considered agroforestry, it must satisfy the four I's as laid out by the USDA. So, agroforestry systems must be intentional. They must be intentionally designed and managed. They're not just random mixtures of trees and crops. The placement of species and spacing, as well as timing, are all carefully planned. They also need to be intensive, involving the active and continuous management of multiple components, such as pruning, harvesting, IPM, and soil fertility management. On top of all of this, or to add to this, so to speak, agroforestry is integrated. It's combining two or more components into a unified system that strives to work together not only ecologically, but economically as well. And trees and crops are not in competition in this system, and they're designed to benefit each other through nutrient cycling, microclimate improvement, and erosion control. And finally, interactive. Agroforestry systems are managed to encourage beneficial reactions between the components. The idea here is to build a system that's greater than its parts, boosting productivity, resilience, and sustainability. And I'd like to clarify that agroforestry is by no means a new concept. This has been practiced by indigenous communities in the US and around the world for centuries. So before we dive into, the types of agroforestry, I just wanted to get some pictures up in front of you guys to, get your brains thinking about what I'm talking about here. So for example, on the left-hand side, we have a image of Black Angus cattle grazing a black locust and walnut plantation at Angus Glen Farm in New York. This is an example of a silvopasture agroforestry production system, which we will dive into in our next slide. And then additionally on the right, we have a forest cropping system. In this image, the medicinal herb golden seal is being managed under a managed forest canopy. So what are the different types of agroforestry? So now that we've created a basic foundation, it's time to define the different types and as well as an integrated production system. So let's look at these five widely recognized categories. First, we have silvopasture. So silvopasture production systems aim to combine trees with livestock and forage on one piece of land to create a mutually beneficial system. It looks to support animal health, tree growth, and pasture productivity all at once. These trees may provide timber, fruit, nuts, or fodder, which is livestock food, as well as shade and shelter for livestock in their forage. Next, we have forest farming, like the example with the golden seal, also called forest cropping or multi-story cropping, goes by a couple of different names for all the same thing. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's the intentional cultivation of high-value specialty crops under a managed forest canopy. This can include things like medicinal herbs that we've seen, such as ginseng or golden seal, culinary herbs like mushrooms and ramps, decorative products like ferns, mosses, and floral greenery, and more. Now, I kind of want to elaborate on two linear agroforestry process or practices. The first one being riparian forest buffers. So riparian forest buffers are strips of trees and shrubs as well as grasses that are planted along streams, rivers, and other bodies of water. They help reduce nutrient runoff, filter pollutants, stabilize stream banks, and ultimately reduce erosion, which can be especially important to vegetable systems that can be pretty nutrient intensive sometimes and sensitive to erosion. Additionally, we have windbreaks. This is another agroforestry minded practice that is utilized by farms all over the world. They help to shelter crops from soil and wind and snow and rain. And I've personally actually seen this being used on a couple of different farms that I've had the opportunity to, explore and chat with, which we will see in this next slide. So for this slide, I have two images. On the left, I have a riparian forest buffer of vegetation lining a farm creek in Story County. And then additionally on the left, we have a windbreak planting at Woodland Enterprises Blueberry Farm in Holland, Michigan, and as the planting of rows of trees and or shrubs to create alleys within which agricultural or horticultural crops are produced. So what does this mean? This means that if I was going to describe to you what this was going to look like, you would have rows of trees usually planted. I've consistently seen about 30 feet apart, but depending on the system, this can vary, with crops being planted between the alleys. And we're going to elaborate on this a little bit more. But this type of system can be designed to produce fruits, vegetables, grains, flowers, herbs, bioenergy feeds, and more. The possibilities are really endless with this type of system. And specifically in vegetable systems, alley cropping can benefit vegetables by providing microclimate benefits like shade, wind protection, and moisture retention. They can improve soil health through leaf litter provided by the trees, root stabilization, and nitrogen fixation, especially if you're working with legumes. It can enhance biodiversity, attracting beneficial insects and pollinators, as well as offering multiple income streams, vegetables from the alleys, fruits from the trees or nuts, and ultimately timber from the trees. This type of system can support nutrient cycling, carbon sequestration, and erosion control. So let's take a look at a couple of examples of this. So this image on the left is my favorite example by far of alley cropping. This is a 25-year-old asparagus planting at New Forest Farms in Wisconsin. And then additionally, I have a picture of a cereal rye cover cropping at Green Things Farm Collective in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I believe that they would honestly be an excellent candidate for alley cropping. Now I wanted to talk about alley crop options. So alley cropping systems utilize 5 basic groups of companion crops between rows. This is not the end all be all. These are just examples and lists of examples of crops that have been utilized or are currently being utilized with success. So first we have row and cereal crops. This is things like corn, soybeans, wheat, barley, oats, potatoes, peas, and beans. Additionally, we have forage crops, so things like fescue, orchard grass, disodium, bluegrass, ryegrass, brome, timothy, clover, and alfalfa. We have specialty crops, so landscape or decorative woody floral plants like blue spruce, dogwood, redbud, Christmas trees, small fruit and nut trees or shrubs, and medicinal crops like golden seal or ginseng. We also have short rotation shrubs or fast-growing trees, so poplars, willows, silver maples, birches, and herbaceous crops like switchgrass would all be excellent examples of those. And then finally, vegetable crops, which is the bread and butter of this presentation. So things like squash, cabbage, beans, asparagus, peppers, melons, and tomatoes. So compared to a monoculture system, alley cropping can provide increased economic diversity, increased land use efficiency, and increased overall farm yield. It also has the ability to transition to a new enterprise gradually rather than all at once. Reduced wind and water erosion is a benefit, improved pollinator and wildlife habitat, the potential for reduced incidence of pests and diseases, increased air and soil moisture, increased carbon sequestration, and reduced nutrient leaching to groundwater. And I'd also like to mention that these benefits can all be points of marketing. Um, Customers love to hear when farmers and growers are, using sustainable practices that the customer cares about. So, capitalizing on, saying that you're helping with carbon sequestration, that you're a pollinator and wildlife habitat, things like that. And then the limitations of this type of system compared to a monoculture system would be more complex pesticide applications. Typically these systems are utilizing multiple species, and sometimes this can become quite difficult when trying to make a pesticide application to target one specific pest, and it really limits your pesticide options. Competition between trees and crops for water nutrients is another limitation that I've actually been reading some research about. This is an area that's actively being researched and trying to find solutions to this other than root pruning. A longer time horizon for cash flow. So, like I said, you're benefiting off the annual cash flow from your crops in the alley, but you're gonna have a little bit of a longer cash flow for fruits and nuts or timber, can be anywhere from a couple of years to a couple of decades. Possible challenges for equipment use. This was something that I go over in my learning module. There's a farm out in Illinois that had this challenge, and they actually had to experiment with different alley croppings for a while to see what would work with what was compatible with their harvester. Lower crop yields for some commodity crops. So, corn and soybeans comes to mind. So overall, your corn and soybean yield is going to be lower in an alley cropping compared to a monoculture system, just because of that competition between the annual crops and the trees. Capital investment for initial tree and shrub establishment can be pretty high, especially if you're just starting out and you got to purchase tens to hundreds of different trees and shrubs for your system. And then the system obviously would require some long-term secure land tenure. This, like I said, with those medium-term and long-term cash flows can take anywhere from a couple of years to a couple of decades, depending on what your specific production system type would be. So this is a really great illustration that I found that I think, it captures maybe not the entirety, but a lot of the factors that go into an alley cropping system and considerations for an alley cropping system. So as you can see here, we have 3 rows of trees with what appears to be annual lettuce plantings between them. So on the far left, you can see that the trees are reducing the wind speed and wind erosion, which is very beneficial. But then on the flip side, as these trees age, they're going to shade out sometimes your annual crops as the sun moves throughout the day. And this can be beneficial to a farmer, or it can be a limitation depending on your specific production system. So farmers that are trying to grow cold crops can benefit from this by extending their cold crops out throughout the warmer season, because the trees, with that microclimate, reduce the temperature, reduce the amount of sun that these crops are receiving. And then on the flip side, if you're a warm season farmer, this can be quite detrimental to your production. This could greatly decrease your photosynthetic capacity for your crops, and this could be something that would not work for you. You can also see here that they point out the zone of nutrients and soil moisture competition. Like I said, this is an area that's actively being researched, and currently the only way or solution that I have found that farmers are using or utilizing is root pruning. So you can see that these trees create organic matter. They drop organic matter, which can decompose back into the soil, which is part of the whole nutrient cycling process here. The trees can improve capture of excess nutrients, especially if you're using fertilizers for your annual crops. Trees obviously are fantastic at carbon sequestration, and they also increase habitat diversity, which can be a really major benefit, but it can also be quite a detrimental drawback depending on what wildlife you're attracting and what production system that you're working with. This is an issue that I've seen farmers talk about a little bit in my research. So now that we've talked about and established, what agroforestry is, the different types, benefits and limitations, it's time to really, crack down on the economics of this situation. Economically, alley cropping offers farmers a diverse and resilient income stream, taking advantage of providing an annual income off the companion planting, as well as a medium term income from the fruits and nuts that can be provided from the tree plantings, as well as timber as a potential long term source of income. On top of that, it's important to factor in ecosystem services provided by utilizing this approach. Ecosystem-minded approaches can reduce long-term additional input by the farmer and can be cost-saving over time. With the nutrient cycling capability of the perennial tree and shrub plantings, potentially reducing the amount of fertilizers needed, decreasing irrigation needs, and offering wind protection like we talked about. Additionally, alley cropping has been shown to improve land productivity, where growing two crops together can be greater than growing the same crop in a monoculture or pure stand. For example, with alley cropping system, maybe 70% of the crop yield if that land was monocropped. The producer would also receive income from the tree crops, making up or exceeding the difference lost from switching to the system and loss from the annual plantings versus a monocrop system. Not only this, but there are many, many incentives and grants available from the USDA and more to help expand agroforestry practices as sustainability is in our future. So now that we've talked about a little bit of this stuff, I really want to talk about design considerations. And I apologize that my head is stuck up in this corner. I can't really move it. I've tried, so you're just going to have to bear with me. So, first and foremost, when you're considering designing an operation like this, you need to have your goals for the system clearly laid out, considering the crops themselves as well as your primary market. Who are you selling this to? Who are your customers? What are they looking for? It's also important to take in consideration the equipment that you have available. Are in the learning module, there's a farm that had to experiment a little bit because their harvester has to fit over their current production system, and it couldn't with some of the alley croppings that they chose. Obviously, soil, climate, and site are taken into consideration. This helps choosing species and managing spacing to ensure accessibility for timely management practices such as pruning. The height and the width of trees and shrubs, especially over time, need to be taken into consideration. Tree row orientation and arrangement need to be taken into consideration. Light management, competition, and then this is a really big one that I seen that some farmers said they had wished they had realized back when they designed that they had not taken into consideration is change over time. When you're working with perennial systems like this, trees and shrubs grow. This can influence the light, water, and nutrients in the field itself. And then this is kind of what sets alley cropping apart from monocropping systems. Those trees are going to be there year after year, and they're going to get bigger every year, obviously depending on your production system. And last but definitely not least is allelopathic species. So allelopathic species release chemicals that can kill or stunt other species as a part of their defense system or just their protection system. A great example of this would be black walnut is an allelopathic species. So you just need to be aware of the allelopathic potential of species and whether or not that is something that they are able to do. So to kind of wrap this up a little bit, I really wanted to drive home, why agroforestry? Why is this important? Why is this something that I personally, am wanting to encourage other young farmers and other farmers to do? And, primarily it's it boosts sustainability and soil health. At the end of the day, that is one of the big takeaways from this production system. It's a perennial system. It improves soil structure. It reduces erosion, increases soil organic matter. It increases biodiversity, all things that we're looking to do in the future as sustainable farmers, and sort of moving away from these monocrop systems that, well, yes, they produce large yields that we need. They're also, they're deteriorating the soils in the land, and that takes time to fix. And this system can be used to fix this. There's actually an example of this in Alabama right now. A farmer, you know, was given a plot of land that was biologically pretty much dead. Nothing could really grow there. So, with careful time, consideration, planning, and design, he put an agroforestry system in and has virtually almost healed the land there. It increases land use efficiency. There's multiple layers of productivity here on one piece of land. You have your annual cropping, you have your medium long term cash flow from fruits and nuts, you have timber available. The system combats climate change. Trees specialize in carbon sequestration, and then this type of system can really protect farmers from extreme weather, and then make them resilient. This can provide economic stability, diversified income, long-term investment returns. Like I said, with the multiple characteristics here, improves water retention and use. Shaded soil increased leads to increased water retention. And then finally, it encourages regenerative thinking. We're actively healing the land here. This is a systems-based approach. So just to kind of wrap this up quickly, this is my references. I encourage you guys to check them out. I have some awesome videos in here, some papers that I read, some websites that are really informational for this. I have one of these videos in my learning module, and I have two peer-reviewed articles as well in there for you guys to enjoy. So thank you guys so much, and enjoy the rest of your day.